Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Monica Alba in Washington, where President Trump is facing an onslaught of developments, from renewed escalations in the Middle East and an expanding war with Iran to rising consumer prices, while the Fed bucks his demand to cut interest rates, all against the backdrop of dismal polling on major issues heading into the midterms. Last night, the Pentagon confirming it carried out joint strikes alongside Saudi Arabia on Iranian-aligned targets in Iraq, putting an end to the days-long pause in U.S. attacks. The Pentagon also announcing yesterday that Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in an attempted surprise attack against U.S. forces in the region. President Trump furious with Iran's attempted strikes, issuing a profanity-laced threat, telling Fox News, quote, "We're going to beat the effing blank out of them," adding, quote, "We'll be hitting them hard. They're going to get a beating." Moments ago in the Oval Office, President Trump doubling down on his threat to hit back.
It's a little more of the same, but it's going to be straightening out. It's going to be straightening out. In the meantime, we're going to be hitting them very hard because it's our turn to hit them. They know it's coming. They're asking us not to do it, but they tried shooting it last night. So we had 5 rockets shot going 8,500 miles an hour, and all 5 rockets were knocked down to the ground. But they nevertheless took a shot, so it's our turn. And we'll see if we get there with an agreement at some point, but we're going to hit them very hard.
It's been a roller coaster ride for fuel prices this month, with oil prices jumping back up amid fears of a renewed military escalation with Iran. Meanwhile, the average cost of gas remains above $4 a gallon. And as gas prices continue to drive up inflation, today, the president's new Federal Reserve chair keeping the benchmark interest rate unchanged, despite pressure from the president earlier this week to lower rates.
Kevin's fantastic, but he's got a board, and the board members are very political, I would say. So, we fight our way through the race because we're doing so well. But, no, he's got a board. He wants to do the right thing. I know what he wants to do. But you need the consent of some people that have perhaps bad intentions. Rates should be lowered.
Markets today plunging into the close of the trading session, with the Dow tumbling more than 1,000 points, falling more than 2%. All of this spelling bad news for the president as he heads into the midterms, with new polling showing he's underwater on several key issues, from the war in Iran, the economy, and immigration, all issues he has touted as strengths of his administration. Joining me now is our team of reporters. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is at the White House, and with me on set is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. In a moment, we'll be joined by NBC News business and data correspondent Cheung. Kelly, I'll start with you here. Do we have any clarity on the president's thinking about his Iran strategy following all the latest developments from his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, the attempted surprise attack on U.S. forces, and now this latest threat that Iran will get a, quote, beating?
Well, the president's comments that you just played are really representative of the way we hear him talk about this conflict. And the president tends to move back and forth between some of the day's events and then the larger strategy, where he will repeat that they will not get a nuclear weapon, referring to Iran. He's been a little bit distant from Benjamin Netanyahu in comments leading up to his meeting with him earlier this week. Of course, Netanyahu in Washington for the Graham funeral, talking about an expectation that Netanyahu would present him with some additional intelligence, and the president sort of was dismissive about that he already knew what he needed to know, and that U.S. capabilities from the sky, from the Space Force, as he described it, allow them to get a lot of intelligence. So the president is in a bit of a tit-for-tat mode as he is talking about Iran's conduct and then hitting them again hard, often saying that Iran's leadership wants to make a deal, and yet they're not ready for a deal. So it's this sort of leaving all options on the table, not in the conventional sense of that, but in a way more rhetorically, of the president can kind of pick from these different options when he's talking about Iran. In the Oval today, his major focus was renovation at Dulles Airport in Virginia, and he opened it up to questions and took questions on a number of topics, including Iran, because certainly from the reporters in the room, this is a critical issue, especially in light of Iran striking at U.S. capabilities and entities, and having questions about all of the resources that the U.S. brings to bear on this.
Yeah, it's hard to make sense of the potential diplomatic path here, Kelly, when the president is talking with that escalated rhetoric, but the administration claims that that is still also continuing on a parallel track. But let me just ask you about that latest polling we just showed that really reveals the president is underwater on some key issues heading into the midterms. Does the administration have a plan to try to turn around that public sentiment?
Well, many of the issues that are reflected in that polling are exactly the kinds of things that Republicans in Congress who face election themselves, the president, of course, not on the ballot, even though his administration and his conduct in office and his standing right now is very much on the ballot. They are saying to focus more on the issues that deal with everyday concerns that Americans have. Within that, of course, is trying to get a de-escalation of the conflict in Iran, bringing that to an end so that things like energy prices become more stable and become more affordable. So a strategy is simply trying to get the president to focus on some of these other domestic issues at a time when the 4 to 6 week war has moved into its 6th month, giving a sense very real terms for the American people that this has gone on longer than they expected, and the consequences and costs are real in everyday lives of American citizens, as well as the political fate of the president.
Yeah, great reminder on the timeline there, Kelly O from the North Lawn. Thank you, Kelly. Courtney, I do want to turn to you. And what are you watching for as the president threatens to lash out against Iran?
So there's one big thing that's been lost in the last 24 hours or so. We know that the CENTCOM announced that Iran launched these ballistic missiles into the region. They called it the surprise attack. And then soon after, they announced that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia had carried out attacks inside of Iraq against Iranian-backed militias. What's really notable, that was not a direct response to the Iranian ballistic missiles that were fired in this surprise attack. That, in fact, was something that the CENTCOM had been talking about, had been planning for, because for the previous 72 hours or so before that, these Iranian-backed groups have been firing drones at U.S. allies and personnel. We reported about it earlier in the week. And notably, they have taken more than 600 different strikes at the U.S. and U.S. allies in Iraq since the war in Iran began. It just hasn't gotten as much attention because the vast majority have been knocked down. So last night's U.S.-Saudi joint strikes were direct response to the Iranian militia groups. The U.S. still has not retaliated for what the ballistic missile attack last night. That's what I'm watching for, is how will at this point, it's not an if, it's a when the U.S. responds and how they do so.
The president did talk about those strikes with some specificity today. Did that stand out to you? What does that tell you?
It did. I was surprised when he talked about the exact, that there were 5 ballistic missiles. That's not something that came out from U.S. CENTCOM. And he talked about the exact speed that they flew, which could indicate, give us a little bit more of a sense of the type of missile that was launched. Also, he talked about how the U.S. shot them down. He said that the U.S. used Patriots. So kind of detail that we don't normally get, not super surprising, but just not always the kind of detail that we would get. And the military would generally say they don't want to talk about those details for operational security reasons. I will say we've been checking just to be sure, because even though those missiles were intercepted, there are cases where an intercept, when the intercepting missile fired by the U.S. hits the incoming Iranian missile and they break up, it can cause debris to fall. That can actually cause damage and injuries down below. We have no indications of any injuries or damage to infrastructure.
You touched on Saudi Arabia joining the U.S. in those strikes. What should we make of that? And do you expect that that will continue now when there could be more strikes? Should we see more of that?
So remember, the Houthis have threatened to go after Saudi ships in the Red Sea. So they are bringing Saudi Arabia into this. And we have seen more threats against Saudi Arabia. I don't know if that means that if, in fact, this resumption of major combat operations or any kind of escalation inside Iran would lead to the Saudis being a part of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, the Houthis continue to threaten the Saudis, specifically shipping and commerce, if we see them lashing out inside Iran. But at this point, I don't know that this is going to be more of a joint effort, at least with the Saudis. The Israelis, that's another thing. We may see more coordination with the U.S. and Israel.
Courtney, as always, has us so well covered militarily. Brian, let's turn now to the other side of this coin, right? The economic picture and the implications. The Fed kept interest rates unchanged. You were there. You were covering it. What do you make of that decision and what it tells us about the state of the economy?
Yeah, I got stuck in a little bit of traffic on Constitution Ave.
It
coming
happens
back.
to the best of us.
DC traffic is no joke. But look, this was a pretty instrumental decision from the chairman, who, by the way, is only in his 2nd meeting since being appointed by Trump in this role. And this is a very uncertain economy that he faces. And in fact, this was the first meeting I can recall in recent memory where there was a real surprise opportunity there, because the Federal Reserve usually is one of these news items where we know exactly what they're going to do before they then do it. But this was one where people were saying there's a real chance that they could surprise everybody by raising interest rates. And the reason why is because if inflation is high, then what does the Fed usually do? They usually raise interest rates. Now, there is some inflation here as a result of the war. Obviously the military aspect of this is one part of this, but the other part of this is the economic impact, because higher oil prices means that things could get more expensive. It costs more to transit everything. So the Fed chair did appear to acknowledge, despite holding interest rates steady, that this is something that's weighing on Americans. Take a listen to how he messaged it to the average American.
For some households, businesses, and market professionals, 5 years of high inflation have left a mistaken impression that's hard to shake, that the Fed's implicit inflation target was somehow above 2%. Let me reiterate, there is no soft inflation target. There is no soft implicit target, not on this committee's watch. There's only a target, and it's 2%.
And I have to say really quickly, Monica, I mean, the Fed is not something that most people will be able to translate, but I didn't really know exactly what was being said in a lot of this press conference, too, because despite all of that, why would you not then use your tool to lower inflation by raising interest rates today? And I think part of it is the uncertainty from the war. In Kevin Warsh's defense, he doesn't know when that conflict is going to end, but it's going to very quickly be an unsatisfactory answer for the American people if inflation continues to be high, but the Fed doesn't do anything about it.
Yeah, none of us know, right?
Right.
So stocks tumbled today, right? With the Dow tumbling in particular. What spooked markets? Help us understand that.
I think what spooked markets is they don't know what the Fed's going to do next. And that is a deliberate strategy from this new Fed chair that wants to do away with what they call forward guidance. It's kind of that inside baseball economic speak for telling people what the Fed's next moves might be. He basically wants to keep the markets in the dark and, as he describes it, let the markets chase the ball, not the referee, which he describes as the Fed. But the problem with that is if you don't tell the markets what you're going to do next, well, then you leave it up to imagination for what might happen next. And so for that reason, we've actually seen bond yields just in the last few minutes since this press conference end shoot higher. What might that mean? That can mean higher borrowing costs for things like 30-year fixed mortgages, which are already at 6.76%. For anyone on the sidelines trying to buy a house, they know that that's a lot more painful than it was at the beginning of this year when it was closer to 6%. So you have higher costs as well as potentially higher mortgage rates.
And just quickly before we go, oil prices ticking up as well. What could that mean for inflation?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, obviously we feel that at the pump, where AAA says that the national average is $4.09 a gallon. That is well above the pre-war average of $2.98. But you also have the volatility around all the news items around this war. If there are more missiles being launched at each other, well, that's going to likely lead to oil prices going higher, because it's all about the Strait of Hormuz. A fifth of the world's oil travels through there. Tankers don't go through, oil prices go up. That can mean that shipping costs get higher. That means everything else could get more expensive. That is something that the Federal Reserve, as well as everyday Americans, are watching.
Brian and Courtney, thank you so much. Great to have this conversation in person. Yeah. All angles covered. Appreciate that.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or watch live on our YouTube channel.